Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing Iran and, of course, the nuclear deal as well, the JCPOA. Joe Biden, who is currently the president-elect of the United States as of this recording, has said that he is willing to go back to the nuclear deal. However, he does have conditions. The Iranians, of course, have responded to that, saying that he's in no position, as in the U.S. is in no position to place more conditions upon the country, considering it was the U.S. itself, under, of course, Donald Trump, that decided to walk away from the deal. This deal, of course, is not a bilateral treaty or a deal in any way, but this is a multi-party agreement and deal that was signed, including various countries in Europe as well, who have tried, at least on the outside, to save this deal as much as is possible. One other thing which is important to mention is also that of uranium enrichment. We know the Iranian parliament, this of course coming in response to the Fakhrizadeh assassination, has now said that uranium enrichment should be upped to around 20%. That would then be, of course, against the deal itself. Rouhani administration, or President Rouhani himself, is against the implementation of such a law itself. Can Rouhani hold this sort of thing off? Does he even have that sort of power at this time, considering, of course, the Iranian elections too are not very, very far off as we speak. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Kourosh Shamlou, who is an attorney at law and international relations expert. He's joining us today from the French capital, Paris. Joining us from the Iranian capital, Tehran, is Tohid Asadi, who is a former academic guest at the University of Zurich. He's also a researcher at the University of Tehran. Tohid and Kourosh, thank you both for your time today, and thank you for joining us. Tohid, let me start with you. Let's firstly talk about Joe Biden, the president-elect of the U.S., saying that he is willing to come back to the JCPOA, but then he does have more conditions which the Iranians would need to meet. Will the Iranians negotiate with him, do you think?
Well, as you know, Joe Biden is going to take the office in January, and as you mentioned, Rouhani is going to have election and is going to leave the office after June election in Iran. So basically, we know that there is a golden period of 6 months for Biden, and I think President-elect tries to seize this opportunity in order to make things less complicated when it comes to Iran-U.S. relations. And at the end of the day, we see that considering this very unique opportunity, the U.S. president or president-elect tries to put some preconditions, knowing the fact that his country is the one that unilaterally withdraw from the deal, basically with no reason, and just considering that he tries to get back to the deal. I think it is Iran that should just put some preconditions, knowing the fact that it is the country, I mean, Iran is the country that has experienced serious lack of commitment from the deal. Just practically speaking, let's just take a look at the history. In 2015, when the deal was signed and sealed and later on adopted as a Security Council resolution, the truth of the matter was that just years after United States just withdraw from the deal and European Union partners, they started to just do nothing in practice except for some nice words, some verbal statements, which turned out to have no benefits for Iran. The tangible output out of this whole negotiations, talks, and the deal was almost nothing in terms of benefit for Iran. So for the past years, let it be clear, patience is the name of the game that Iran has been practicing pertaining to the deal, and the practical outcome is nothing. Okay. And one last thing I wanted to add, if I may, is the context. Just the time when the deal was signed, we had kind of less complicated, less tensious situation between Iran and the West and Iran and the United States in particular. Let's have it in mind that just nearly 1 year ago, Iranian top general was assassinated by U.S. forces, and just a couple of days ago, Iranian top nuclear scientist was assassinated by one of United States' closest allies, and this is, I think, something that makes the situation really complicated.
Indeed. Kourosh, if we may go back to the JCPOA for a moment, because this was a deal, right, that was signed. There are laws about these sorts of things. There's even a UN resolution about this that was agreed upon by the countries that are a part of this deal. Can Biden, according to even international laws, come in and say, okay, no, I'm going to change this deal, I'm going to add on more things to this deal?
Thank you for having me on. No, I don't think he can come and say, I want to add more things, because he said that he's going to rejoin the Iranian nuclear deal before being elected, and he has confirmed this again, that he's going to join. And now, during this time of transition, he's saying that he wants to renegotiate or add more things, as like to the conventional weapons, in order to control the weapons of Iran. And Iranians said no. Basically, they said no. They said, we don't want any preconditions. You should first lift all the sanctions and then rejoin the Iranian deal, because the Iranian themselves respected all their obligation. Now, of course, they enrich uranium more, but President Rouhani said that if Biden administration rejoins the Iranian deal without any condition, and if he lifts all the sanctions, Iranians will do the same, and they can go from that deal. If Joe Biden wants to put more conditions, he's going to have to discuss. And as you said, Iran's going to have a new president in June. They're going to have 6 months in order to do that. And we don't know if in Iran it's going to be an open-minded president, or is it going to be a conservative?
Yeah, because Tohid, on that point of conservative versus, principalist versus reformist in Iran, how much of a difference will that make, that change, if there is a huge change in the country? Because, Rouhani right now, it can be argued at least, is lame duck in the sense that, his hands are tied, if we're completely honest, right? Because, the nuclear deal has essentially, in many ways, fallen apart. The economic situation in the country is very, very harsh, even for people who used to make good money. And then obviously that there's the assassinations of General Soleimani, as well as of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh as well. All of that puts a lot of pressure on him. Can he really do much at this time?
Well, I can say that part of the story is not related really to political orientations. There was this, let's say, diversity, and there was this differences of mind among Iranian politicians and officials about whether or not Iran should go through the trajectory of negotiations. And this was tested for one more time, at least, after JCPOA. And then currently speaking, specifically, it's not a matter of left or right. It's not a matter of principalist or reformist. I think currently speaking, there is this consensus among Iranian officials to a great extent that testing the trajectory of negotiations one more time with the United States is not going to be that much fruitful, just considering the history of the things that has taken place. There was this tendency among reformists to go through this trajectory, but after all these stories and after all these experiences, it turned out that this trajectory and this specific path is not worth testing. And then let it be clear on another point, and that is related to the grand strategy that exists in Washington. So there was this assumption that Biden was elected, and after his coming to the office later on in a couple of months ahead, there is going to be a paradigmatic shift in Iran-U.S. relations, which is a false assumption, as I believe, because just there is a grand strategy in Washington pertaining to the holistic behavior of foreign policy of the country in terms of Iran, and that is not a subject to change, because tactically speaking, there might be some modifications. The whole story is not going to change, I believe. And maybe one of the evidences, one of the proof that I can raise to support this idea is Biden's own statement. He just a couple of months ago, if I'm not mistaken, he just mentioned that I'm not going to lift the sanctions, but I'm going to take a smarter approach towards Iran and towards putting this pressure. So up until this moment, I'm not convinced really that he's going to lift this maximum pressure campaign and all these brutal, cruel sanctions implemented in a very barbaric way upon Iran. This is not going to we are not going to observe this story just immediately taking place after his coming to the office. But there might be a very, slight change of behavior. So, and I think Iran inside it has got this consensus towards this point that they should be independent and they should not really rely on, let's say, some promises of trust just made by Biden's administration.
And on that point of promises, Tohid, if you'd allow me to come in, because Kourosh, the other players here, the Europeans, are also extremely important in this case, right? When it comes to the nuclear deal, the Europeans have said that they are trying to do their best to save the deal. Do you still think that that is the case? And do you think that they are, obviously there's this meeting as well, I believe, between the French, British and German foreign ministers after Biden won, saying that they would try to pressure Biden into coming back to the deal. Does Europe really have that kind of power to be able to save this deal and to pressure the U.S. to come back to this deal?
They don't have that power to pressure the United States to join the deal, but Europeans have the will to stay in the deal and to keep Iran in the deal. And of course, as you said, bring the Americans. The deal depends only and only to the will of now to the Biden administration. Europeans, since Donald Trump left the Iran nuclear deal, tried to stay in the deal, invented a special vehicle in order for European countries, European companies to invest in Iran by that special vehicle called Instex, which hasn't done anything much yet. But they want to stay in the deal, and they don't want Iran to go further and enrich more uranium because they know it might be much more dangerous. And this politic of maximum pressure hasn't done much because, of course, the Iran economy is in the eve of collapse, but they still can hold. And Americans should know that the only way to keep Iran to get to that to this nuclear program is to invest in Iran and not to try to contain Iran, because Iran wants to stay a regional power. They want to have their word heard in this region, and if they can't do anything about their conventional weapons or in their army, it doesn't mean anything for them to stay in that nuclear program. It's better for them to get rid of that program and to continue with their expansion and, of course, their nuclear program.
Very well. We'll leave that as our final word, as the clock has gotten the best of us. We sincerely appreciate both Kourosh and Tohid for their time today. Tohid speaking to us today from Tehran. Kourosh was speaking to us there from Paris, sharing their expertise and thoughts with us about what may very well happen in the coming days vis-a-vis the United States and President-elect Joe Biden talking about possibly coming back into the JCPOA. Will that really happen? He does not technically have the right, according to international law, to add on things onto this deal in and of itself. He can, of course, sign separate agreements if he so wishes, and if Iran does agree, which is fairly unlikely, according to all Iranian officials, and especially the context, as Tohid there correctly mentioned, of the Fakhrizadeh assassination as well as the Soleimani assassination, that sort of change that has now occurred in the U.S.-Iran relations, the worsening, I should say, of the U.S.-Iran relations, leaves a lot less trust now than there was even going into the nuclear deal. So it will not be easy for either Rouhani, for the time that he has remaining in office, as well as for Biden as the new U.S. president, to really get much done in that regard. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to hone in on white supremacy. According to Jigsaw, which is the research arm of Google and a study that it's carried out, white supremacist groups have used the internet, and no surprise there, of course, to recruit and even train followers. That's according to the study. The study also, more importantly, in my opinion, of course, shatters the image of white supremacists as being lone wolves. We can talk, of course, about the Christchurch attacker, et cetera, et cetera. There's There's many, of course, whose names that can come to mind. Anders Behring Breivik, for example, also. And all of the above have always been spoken of as lone wolves in some regards. But the study says that this is not the case, in fact, and that this myth is, in fact, a dangerous one that keeps, that it is perpetrated over and over again when it comes to this sort of extremist movement. The movement is a lot larger and more extreme than we may realize, according to the study again. And numbers even collected by the University of Meriden Global Terror Database have depicted a network that has been growing globally since even before, of course, Donald Trump came into office. This is back from the year 2010 onwards till today. Let's discuss all of that a bit further, and I'm joined by Dr. Matthew Hughey, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut. He's joining us this morning from Storrs in Connecticut. Joining us from Hartford, Connecticut is Dr. Johnny Eric Williams, who is a professor of sociology at Trinity College. Johnny and Matthew, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Johnny, let me start with you. Let's firstly talk about the fact that the internet is still being used to recruit and train these white supremacists, I should say, pardon me. Do you think that these social media companies have been very slow on the uptake when it comes to realizing the threat?
Well, I believe that the internet companies didn't care too much about the white supremacists using that platform for a while. They would hide behind the guise of in the United States, free speech, the First Amendment. But of late, though, because of the movement for Black Lives and the popularity of it, which it was popular, but I don't know how popular it is right now, that these companies are now trying to do something, but it's not a major something, though. It's because these companies themselves are also embedded with people who think in whiteness terms. That is, they believe that white is superior and that Black is inferior, and so on and so on.
What are your thoughts on that? Because again, it's not like it's new, right? It's not like this is new information that the internet's being used to spread extremism and that to white supremacy.
Right. I mean, we've seen these kinds of ebbs and flows in how white supremacy, white nationalists, other kinds of white racialists have used the internet to varying degrees and various sites on the web to various degrees for a long time now. In the United States, I think many forget that just after the election of Barack Obama in 2008, you had a huge uptick of white nationalists and white supremacist activity. One website, popular website at the time that was popular among white nationalists, even crashed the day after the election in 2008 from all the new white nationalist activity on that website. So we've seen this happen. This is nothing new. What is new is some of the sophistication in which white nationalists and white supremacist groups are using websites like this in order to hide their activity or to create kind of cloaked websites and different forms of activity that's harder to surveil, harder for law enforcement to catch. And to Professor Williams's point, often disguises a lot of this activity in First Amendment rhetoric of free speech, which is very popular in the United States. Not as much in some other liberal, westernized democratic nations, but especially extreme in the United States context.
And then, Johnny, then there's the huge argument, and I believe the more important argument about lone wolves, right? Whenever we've had a terror attack carried out by a white supremacist, be it, as I said, Anders Behring Breivik or the Christchurch attacker, Brenton Tarrant, and of course the list is quite long. So each one of them, they've always been spoken of as individuals, with mental health issues, not being spoken of as a group or as people, even though their manifestos, very clearly say they've gotten inspiration from one another. They haven't been spoken of as a group. It's always about lone wolves. How important is it to shatter that facade of the fact that these are lone wolves?
Important to shatter that because in the United States, folk believe that it is just an individual problem. That's what we're taught, we're socialized into. But this is a collective effort of people who believe themselves to be white, right? And it's just not the guys who neo-Nazis, Europa, Identity Europa, and stuff like that. Even the Daily Storm organ that spew this kind of stuff. This is throughout the country. The United States itself is a white supremacy society, right? It values whiteness above all, including class allegiance. So one has to get that straight, right? And Americans have to be re-socialized to understand that this is a collective process on the part of those folk, as well as collaborators. That is, even among people who are racially oppressed, there are collaborators of whiteness within it that also help to protect white supremacy and keep it fueling and going and so forth.
Yeah, on that point, Matthew, it's important, isn't it? Like as I said to Johnny about the lone wolf argument, it's interesting from our standpoint, from my own standpoint as a Muslim. There was always and there's always still is this argument that if somebody carries out a criminal or terrorist act from amongst who is a Muslim, for example, that's blamed on all Muslims, and that's seen as a group collective guilt. But then when it comes to these sorts of crimes carried out by white supremacists and terror attacks, that's not seen as equal in that fashion. I'm not, of course, advocating that all, Caucasians or white people should be blamed for white supremacy, but I'm just saying that what do you make of that discrepancy? How important is it to still realize that these are groups at the end of the day? They get inspiration from each other. There are manifestos out there, etc.
Yeah, so this is an important point that I think really does need to be underscored, especially in the U.S. context, but I think increasingly across the globe, is that white people get to be individuals and that people of color are characterized as a group. And because of this dominant logic, dominant ideology of the ways that we think, or perhaps better said, don't think about race, is that white people are seen as individuals who are given excuses or are kind of rationalized or justified in their hyper-violent or extremist activity. And that has led to serious mistakes from law enforcement all the way down to how normal everyday folks think about or try to analyze this issue, so that white supremacy gets thought of as an exception to the rule rather than as the rule itself. As Professor Williams said, the United States is based on a white supremacist logic and society. The norms of white supremacy permeate the United States society. So much anti-blackness is normative here. So until we get a more thorough and I think in-depth understanding of the extent to which racist and white nationalist assumptions and logic really do permeate how we even start to talk about and consider these issues, we're not really going to gain a lot of purchase on understanding, if not combating, white supremacy.
Johnny, it's an interesting statement that just recently came out from Barack Obama, the ex-president of the U.S., was that he disagrees with the phrase "defund the police." And I'm not saying I'm advocate for or against that, but in the sense that because the arguments have been made and it's been explained, even I've done shows about defund the police and what exactly that would entail and mean, but. In that sense, when you were talking about the enablers, do you think that in some ways that even though Barack Obama was seen as somebody who was symbolic of, a post-racial U.S., that in fact he may very well be the opposite in some ways?
Yeah, he was actually elected as president following George W. Bush's fiasco as president of the United States, his 8 years. And basically he was an effort to rebrand. This is what Clarence Lusane he was at Howard University. I don't know where he is right now, a political scientist. But he was talking about this rebranding effort, and I myself talk about it also, is that Barack Obama was designed to put a new face to it, to white supremacy in the United States, what we commonly call today racial capitalism. And so Barack Obama came in and shored up the system. He reaffirmed the system. And that's what he's doing when he's talking about sloganeering of, sloganeering defunding the police, was basically turning people off. And that's what Democrats do anyway, is they discipline the left in the United States and try to tamp down the expectations of what the Democratic Party should do. So, it's really Barack Obama's role, basically, as the first Black president, to oversee the tamping down of folks' expectations, especially Black folks, Latinos, and Asians in the United States.
Very well. The clock has gotten the best of us, so we're going to leave it there at that as our final word. But we sincerely appreciate both Johnny and Matthew for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their expert insight with us this morning. Speaking to us from Connecticut, that was Matthew and Johnny. white supremacist groups, according to Jigsaw, which is a research arm of Google, have used the internet. Again, not a surprise. We've known this for a while now, to recruit and train even their members. What's more important, though, I think here is the statement that, again, these are not lone wolves. These are people who work as a group, who get inspiration from each other. And that's an extremely important facade to shatter, because till now, every single time there is a white supremacist attack, it's always down to just the individual, as our guest also spoke about in great detail there. That's a detail which we need to get over. We need to accept the fact that these extremists, as with other extremists, are part of groups, get inspiration from each other, and then need to be dealt with on equal footing, as have other groups. And of course, the lessons be learned from how other groups have been treated, with the goods and the bads, on the pros and the cons of how that has worked out. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, a law enforcement training group has been promoting, this is in the U.S., of course, a lengthy research document that urges local police, of course, respective counties and areas within the U.S., to treat Black Lives Matter activists as quote-unquote terrorists. Now, of course, this goes back to an argument that had been made on the part of some within the circle of the U.S. president, as well as something that he may have alluded to as well, also himself, as well as, of course, Antifa and others. This document says that Black BLM terrorists, quote unquote, are plotting a violent revolution. Now, the group's executive director, the group that is this training group's executive director, has defended the document, saying it's one member's opinion, is of course open for critique, and this is free speech. Essentially, he has also argued that it's not the job of his group to fact check papers or to restrict distribution, because that would again amount to censorship, in his opinion. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Judson Jeffries, who's a professor of African American and African Studies at Ohio State University. He's joining us on the line this morning from Columbus, Ohio. Joining us from Brooklyn, New York, is Dr. Oscar Odom III, who is a retired NYPD detective and is also a criminal justice professor at ASA College. Oscar and Judson, good morning to you both, and thank you very much for joining us. Judson, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this document? What do you make of the fact that BLM has been, not just by this document, but has been labeled a violent group at the very least by a number of others?
I find the document a bit disturbing, and the notion that the document is one person's opinion is actually questionable. I doubt very seriously if a document of this volume, nearly 200 pages, would be written and disseminated widely without it getting the buy-in a number of different people. So the idea that this is one person's opinion, that's something that I simply have a lot of doubts about. In terms of labeling organizations like Black Lives Matter terrorist organizations, that's preposterous. I mean, the organization came about as a result of young Trayvon Martin being killed by a young man, 29-year-old gentleman, who apparently wanted to be a police officer all his life, and for whatever reason wasn't able to do so, and as a result became a neighborhood watchman and took his responsibilities a little too seriously. So the document is disturbing. One could easily make the argument that the document came about as a result of an attempt to quell dissent and to keep people who have been historically marginalized in their place as second-class citizens.
Oscar, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, obviously there has been some violence when it comes to, the protests that are taking place. Of course, that's not to say that, the entire BLM movement should be stained, should it?
I agree with my colleague that what he just said. I have approximately 4 years worth of law enforcement experience, and I view this document as being biased. I have trained officers in the largest police department in the world, on the planet, that's NYPD. And to give such a document like this would not only be disturbing, it would be against humanity, it would be against all those things. You know, part of my career, I also served in intelligence division, and I can tell you that Black Lives Matter is not a terrorist organization. I repeat, is not a terrorist organization. When you look at research, I always tell people I like the scholar practitioner approach because I'm an academic and a practitioner. And the thing that I look at when I look at these different things or these models that they're talking about, I think that whoever wrote this or the writers, their lens was biased. It was clouded when they were making these type of statements. And so therefore, and when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, because somebody has a Black Lives Matter sign or somebody is marching along with them and they commit some sort of act, there's two ways you could look at that. One, somebody could be frustrated. And the other thing, they may not even be a member of Black Lives Matter and going out there and committing these type of assaults. So people looking on the outside and looking at this stuff and just drafting documents, that's why we need people to be able to review these documents and review it through the lens of a scholar practitioner to be able to look at that. And like I said, I've worked for the largest police department in the world, and part of my career, I was an academy instructor, in which I trained over 70,000 police officers, and to date, I may be someplace 200,000 officers. So this document, no.
All right, so then Judson, this then goes to the narrative, right, that's been set up about the BLM movement as a whole, and just the protests also, right? Do you think that these are meant to be deflections / distractions from the real issues?
Oh, well, that's an excellent question. My take on it is this. So, well, first of all, I want to make something perfectly clear, because oftentimes when I do these interviews, sometimes message gets lost in the translation. Listen, so police officers, I want to make this perfectly clear. Police officers are easily, in my humble opinion, the most important street-level bureaucrats in the United States of America, and you can find police officers doing good every single day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The problem is when you get a document like this written and disseminated, right? I have no doubt that the majority of police officers across the United States of America don't buy in to this foolishness. I also have no doubt that the overwhelming majority of police officers across the country are just working class blokes trying to put food on their table, shelter over their families' heads, clothes on their children. Black. The people who engage in this murder and criminality are what you would call rogue officers. Very small percent, but what ends up happening is this very small percent ends up being repeat offenders, just committing the same kind of devilish behavior over and over and over. So I just want to make sure that our listeners understand that the overwhelming majority of police officers are good people trying to do good work, and indeed they do good work every single day, 24/7. But in terms of this document, listen. So we are socialized here in the United States of America from a very young age to be obedient and compliant with police officers. So as someone who grew up in New York City, the South Bronx, to be specific. Yeah. So in elementary school, you get visited by police officers on the day called Officer Friendly Day. And the idea is to socialize you to such a degree where you obey officers' commands. You understand that the relationship between you and the police officer is an asymmetrical one, whereby he or she is the boss and you are the subordinate. So when I hear about documents like this being written and disseminated, what it says to me, labeling groups like Black Lives Matter, what it says to me is, hey, listen, how dare you step out of the place that we have consigned you. What it does is it creates fear among the general public, if the general public in a frenzy, trying to indoctrinate the general public with the idea that these groups are terrorist organizations that are threats to American democracy.
And that's a very good point, Judson. I do apologize for cutting you off, but I want Oscar on that point as well, if you allow me. Oscar, this does no favors, right, to the relationship, which is, of course, extremely important, as Judson there spoke about. The relationship between law enforcement and communities of any color and every color would be extremely, extremely important. But this then makes that relationship, improvement of that relationship that much harder, doesn't it?
Oh, most definitely it does. Because, once again, I like to echo the comments of my colleague. One of the things, like I said, for example, New York City Police Department is the largest police department in the world. Approximately at certain times, we have over 30,000, 40,000 police officers. And within 20 years, 99% of the police officers go 20 years or more without firing their weapon one time. 20 years or more. And it's important to see that. And that 1% is not even all the rogue. It's less than that. So it's a small percentage that has that. So what happens is now we already have enough issues going on with the police community relationships. And now you add a document like this for police officers to look at. And even younger officers, if you're giving them this type of information, and with all the hype of the media, with all the hype of what's going on in the world now, and then it tends, it stains the officer and their vision and how they're viewing things. And this is something that we don't want to do. We don't even want a small percentage to be tainted. Because like I say, in my career, I have worked with great officers throughout my career. And to this day, officers that are still out there putting their lives on the line, they're doing great things. And we want to make sure that documents like this does not influence them whatsoever to make them think that this type of activity is true, or this type of way that people view policing or view different organizations are true. Because we're trying to build bridges. We're not trying to break bridges up or destroy bridges. We want to make our police community relationships better. And these type of documents are things that would destroy it. Police officers are still, despite everything that is going on now, they're still running towards robberies. They're still solving murders. They're still solving assaults. They're still solving all these things. Despite everything that is taking place now, they're still going out there and putting their lives on the line. And we must continue to back them, because no matter what your party affiliation is, Republican, Democrat, liberal, unaffiliated, everybody believes in public safety and would like to have great relationships working with the police.
We'll have to leave there as a final word, but we do sincerely appreciate both Oscar and Judson for their time today, and of course for their expert insight, shedding light on this issue of, Black Lives Matter being labeled a terrorist group by this one specific law enforcement training group. Troubling, certainly, because even the group's head has now come out. The executive director of the group, has come out and defended the documents, in fact, and of course then spoken about the free speech and not wanting to censor this document, etc., alluding to the fact that this is one person's opinion, but as Judson there said, a several hundred-page document doesn't just come about by one person's opinion. There's a lot more to this behind the scenes. Yes, there is a troubling relationship, as Judson also alluded to, from a young age, about how one is meant to then obey and not question certain decisions of those who are in authority around them from a very young age. At the same time, the balance needs to be made that, of course, police are there to protect the public, and the vast majority of them do that. But then there are, of course, rogue officers that have carried out a lot of brutal acts, a lot of abusive practices have taken place also, and that also does need to be acknowledged. So we need to come to a balanced view on all of the above when it comes to the U.S. and its relationship between the citizens and, of course, law enforcement officials. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks very much for watching.